Welcome. The different views on regulation can best be introduced by using graphs. Please note, I want to keep it simple and abstract from dynamic interactions, market differentiation, distributional issues, and more that are discussed in advanced courses. This figure presents a framework for assessing the environmental benefits and costs of a new bio-based product, a biodegradable water cup, for instance. The x-axis depicts the quantity Q produced and refers, for example, to biorefineries. The y-axis represents marginal benefits and marginal cost of producing quantity Q. The marginal private benefits decrease with an increase in the production of Q. The marginal private costs increase with production. For the private producer or sector, the optimal quantity Q produced is at point C, where marginal private benefits equal marginal private costs. If no additional benefits or costs need to be considered, meaning all benefits and costs are internalized, point C reflects the optimal level of production for society and is in line with the optimal private sector level of production. The production may bear additional costs not considered under private costs, such as emission of greenhouse gases or releasing toxic compounds into the environment. If these costs are added to the marginal private cost, we get the marginal social cost. The marginal social costs are greater than the marginal private cost. The societal optimal level of production, Q, decreases from QPO to QSO. A possible way of reducing the quantity is by taxing its production. The optimal tax rate, the Pigouvian tax, should increase private costs so that marginal private costs increase and intersect at point D with marginal private benefit. The external effects of production are then internalized. In summary, producers earn less. They lose producer rents, area BECF. Consumers have to pay a higher price. They lose consumer rents, area EADC. The government has tax income equivalent to area BADF. Environmental damage has been reduced. This figure's important message is, despite external costs reducing its production to zero, is suboptimal. A production ban, for example, is unjustified from a benefit-cost perspective by merely observing that producing a product causes negative environmental impacts. The Pigouvian view presented on regulating environmental externalities has been criticized, most prominently by Coase 1960, who argued that observing externalities does not necessarily justify government intervention via, for example, a Pigouvian tax. If we have two stakeholders, A and B, and A is inflicting harm on B, the question is not if A should be allowed to harm B. As the problem is of reciprocal nature, should A be allowed to harm B or B allowed to harm A? The problem is to avoid the more serious harm. Applied to the case of the biorefinery, does the biorefinery have the right to produce biodegradable cups and emit greenhouse gases, A harming B? Or does the government have the right to impose restrictions on the production of biodegradable bottles to reduce the emission of greenhouse gases, B harming A? which solution would be less costly. As stakeholders involved have an incentive to reduce environmental pollution, for example because of company reputation, and environmental and other policies are already present to address environmental problems, finding the correct answer is less straightforward. An investigation is necessary to determine if government intervention can improve the current situation of observed environmental pollution. All institutional arrangements available to address the problem should be considered. As a reference, Coase suggests comparing the outcome of alternative institutional arrangements with the existing situation. An intervention is warranted if a different institutional arrangement improves the outcome. This may include a ban if it is the cheapest solution. Coase's view was challenged by libertarians. The question of government intervention, however, depends on property rights. They argue externalities should be settled by the courts. We have concluded that everyone should be able to do what he likes, except if he commits an overt act of aggression against the person and property of another. Only this act should be illegal, and it should be prosecutable only in the courts under tort law with the victim or his heirs and assigns pressing the case against the legal aggressor. While ex post liability can address a number of environmental externality, this does not per se exclude the use of ex ante regulations, even under the libertarian view. If, for example, everyone freely decides to work together in a group to implement regulations imposed on members of the group. For example, farmers may voluntarily form a group and decide about their own production standard. Further, implementing ex post liability has its own problem. However, the libertarian view does not necessarily contradict the situation shown in the figure. The expected ex post liability costs increase marginal private costs. Further, ex post liability costs provide incentives for implementing ex ante measures to reduce ex post liability, hence increasing the marginal private costs compared to a situation where the possibility is absent, as discussed, for example, in the paper by Beckmann and Wessler for coexistence. In conclusion, externalities bear additional costs under the Pigouvian, Coase, and libertarian views. Views on measuring the cost and appropriate responses differ. These views reach the same conclusion. The mere existence of externalities does not necessarily justify a ban from an economic perspective.